Hello, I'm Joseph Kasser, and welcome to this podcast where the AI team does a deep dive into some application of systems thinking.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at systems thinking.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a fantastic book to guide us on this journey,
Absolutely.
Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella Meadows.
It's a classic.
It really is, and I think it's a book that everyone should read,
Yeah.
no matter what you're interested in,
Mhm.
whether you're running a business or just trying to understand the world around you.
Right.
Systems thinking offers a really powerful way to see things differently.
It's like getting a new pair of glasses.
Exactly. So let's dive in. First things first. What exactly is a system?
Well, you can think of a system as a bunch of interconnected pieces,
Okay.
all working together to achieve something.
Like a well-coordinated team.
Exactly. Each part plays a role, and they interact in a specific way.
Right. So it's not just about the individual parts, but how they relate to each other and the overall goal they're working towards.
Yeah, like a car engine, for example.
Yeah.
You've got all these different parts. Pistons, spark plugs, belts. They all have to work together in a precise way to make the car move.
Meadows talks about elements, interconnections, and purpose. What's the key takeaway there?
Well, she points out something really interesting.
Okay.
Changing the individual elements of a system often has the least impact.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive.
Hmm.
But think about it. A company can have employees come and go,
Right.
but the company itself persists as long as its structure and purpose remain intact.
That's a good point. It's like a sports team, right?
Exactly. You can substitute players, but the team's playbook and the goal of winning stay the same.
So the interconnections and the purpose are the real game changers.
They really are. It's like changing the rules of a game. Even with the same players, you get a completely different outcome.
Okay, so we really need to pay attention to the relationships and goals within a system.
Absolutely.
Now, Meadows also talks about stocks and flows. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. Imagine a bathtub. The amount of water in the tub is the stock.
Got it.
The faucet filling it up is the inflow. And the drain emptying it is the outflow.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
These flows determine how the stock changes over time.
That's a really clear analogy.
This dynamic is everywhere, from your bank account to global population trends.
So sometimes instead of just focusing on adding more, like turning the faucet on full blast,
Right.
the solution might be managing what's leaving the system, like making sure the drain isn't constantly open.
Exactly. Meadows highlights how we often miss opportunities by only focusing on inflows.
That's a good point. It's a reminder to look at the whole picture.
Definitely.
Speaking of the whole picture, Meadows talks about feedback loops.
Yes, the heart of systems thinking.
So what are those all about?
Feedback loops are like a systems communication system.
Okay.
They create these circular cause and effect relationships. They can either maintain stability or trigger exponential change.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, think of a thermostat. It regulates your home's temperature. That's a balancing feedback loop, keeping things in check.
Ah, so the system self-regulates.
Exactly.
But what about those loops that create massive change?
Those are the reinforcing loops, like the spread of a viral video.
Oh, yeah.
Each share leads to more views, which leads to even more shares.
It's like a snowball effect.
Exactly, exponential growth.
Now, this is where things get a bit mind-bending. Meadows talks about how our linear thinking often misses the mark when it comes to systems.
Right, we tend to think A leads to B in a straight line. But in complex systems, that's not always the case.
Because of nonlinearities, right?
Exactly. Small changes can have disproportionate effects.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, think of traffic flow.
Okay.
Adding just a few cars at rush hour can suddenly create a massive traffic jam.
Oh, I've definitely experienced that tipping point. It's like the system suddenly shifts gears.
Precisely. And this nonlinear behavior, it's everywhere. In ecosystems, financial markets, even social dynamics.
So failing to recognize these nonlinearities can lead us into trouble.
It can.
I know Meadows talks about these common system traps.
Ah, yes, the pitfalls of systems thinking.
Can you tell me more about them?
Of course. These traps are patterns of behavior that seem logical at first, but lead to negative consequences for the whole system.
Okay, like what?
One classic example is the tragedy of the commons.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It's when individuals act in their own self-interest, depleting a shared resource.
Can you give us a real-world example?
Sure, imagine a shared pasture.
Okay.
Each herder adds more animals, thinking if I don't, someone else will. But eventually the pasture is overgrazed, and no one can use it anymore.
Right. It's a classic example of how individual actions can have unintended collective consequences.
Exactly. And we see this pattern in overfishing, deforestation, even traffic congestion.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap?
Meadows suggests 3 approaches. Appealing to people's better nature through education, dividing up the commons through privatization, or setting limits through regulation.
So encouraging responsibility, defining ownership, or setting rules of the game.
Right.
What's another one of these system traps?
Another one is policy resistance or fixes that fail.
I have a feeling I'm very familiar with that one.
It happens when we try to solve a problem by only addressing the symptoms
Oh, sure.
instead of the root cause.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Exactly. A classic example is drug enforcement.
Okay.
Despite intensified efforts, drugs remain widely available because the systemic issues driving demand haven't been addressed.
Right. It's about understanding the underlying structure of the system before jumping to solutions.
Exactly.
Okay, what's another trap we should be aware of?
How about drift to low performance?
Oh, that sounds a bit too familiar.
It's when a system gradually lowers its standards, like a company where customer service declines over time.
So it's like accepting mediocrity as the new normal.
Yeah, it can happen slowly and subtly.
So how do we prevent that?
It's all about setting clear goals, maintaining robust feedback mechanisms, and fostering a culture of continuous improvement.
Okay, we've talked about tragedy, the commons, fixes that fail, and drift to low performance. What's next?
Well, we've got escalation.
Escalation?
Yeah, like an arms race.
Oh, okay.
One country builds more weapons, so the other feels compelled to do the same. It creates this dangerous spiral.
Right, so it doesn't just apply to international relations.
No, not at all. It can happen in business with price wars, or even political campaigns that descend into mudslinging.
So what fuels this escalation?
It's often fear, mistrust, and a desire to maintain a competitive edge.
It's like no one wants to back down.
Exactly.
So how do we de-escalate?
The best way is to avoid getting caught in the trap in the first place.
Okay.
Build trust, communicate openly, focus on shared goals, shift from win-lose to win-win.
Right. It's about recognizing that cooperation can be more beneficial.
Exactly.
But what if you're already in that spiral?
Sometimes it takes a bold move, like unilateral disarmament or bringing in a mediator.
Okay, so taking a step back to move forward.
Right.
What's the next trap?
Let's talk about success to the successful.
Okay, what's that one all about?
It's when a system rewards those who are already winning, creating a reinforcing feedback loop that leads to inequality.
So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
In a nutshell, yes.
Can you give an example?
Imagine a school system where funding is based on test scores.
Okay.
Schools in wealthy areas with better resources tend to perform better and get more funding.
So it perpetuates the advantage.
Exactly.
This trap seems like it could have huge social consequences.
It certainly can.
How do we break this cycle?
Meadows suggests things like progressive taxation, social safety nets, and policies that promote equal opportunities.
Okay, so leveling the playing field.
Exactly.
What's the last trap?
The last one is shifting the burden to the intervener.
Okay, explain that one.
It happens when we rely on a quick fix. That ultimately weakens the system in the long run.
Like using pain medication for chronic back pain.
Exactly. It provides temporary relief, but masks the underlying problem.
So it's like giving someone a crutch instead of helping them heal.
Precisely. This system becomes dependent on the intervention.
So how do we avoid that?
We need to focus on solutions that strengthen the system's own resilience.
Okay, so empowering this system to solve its own problems.
Yeah, sometimes the best intervention is no intervention.
Wow, that's an important reminder. Sometimes we need to let the system find its own balance.
Exactly. And this brings us to leverage points.
Ooh, I've been waiting for this. Tell me about them.
Leverage points are places in a system where a small change can have a big impact.
Like pressure points.
Exactly. Meadows calls them places to intervene in a system.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Imagine a city struggling with traffic. Instead of building more roads, what if they improved public transportation?
So you're changing the system itself.
Exactly. Meadows actually gives us a whole list of leverage points, ranked in order of effectiveness.
Awesome. And she says the most effective ones are often the least obvious.
She does.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about them. What's the first one on the list?
At the bottom of the list are things like subsidies and taxes.
Okay.
Meadows says those have the least leverage.
So tweaking numbers.
Right, like adjusting a subsidy by a small percentage.
I can see how that might not change much.
Yeah, it's like trying to fine-tune a recipe by slightly changing the amount of salt.
Right. It might make a subtle difference, but it won't fundamentally change the dish.
Exactly. And these kinds of tweaks are easily reversed.
Okay, so what's the next level up?
Next up are buffers,
Buffers.
like a reservoir that protects against drought.
Okay.
Increasing the size of the buffer can help. But if the underlying problem is water consumption,
Right.
a bigger reservoir is just a temporary fix.
So it's like putting a bigger Band-Aid on a broken bone.
That's a good analogy. What's next? The next level up is changing the structure of stocks and flows.
Okay, so more structural changes.
Right, like redesigning a city's transportation system to reduce congestion.
Or maybe rethinking a manufacturing process to minimize waste.
Exactly. It's more fundamental
Yeah.
than just tweaking numbers.
Right. It's like going from tweaking a recipe to creating a whole new dish.
Exactly. But it can also be more challenging.
Okay, what's next on the leverage point ladder?
Next up is adjusting delays,
Delays.
those time lags between action and effect.
Right. We talked about how those can cause oscillations and unintended consequences.
Exactly. But we can actually use this knowledge to our advantage.
How so?
By recognizing the impact of delays,
Yeah.
we can design systems that are more responsive
Okay.
and resilient.
Can you give us an example?
Imagine shortening the feedback loop between customer feedback and product development.
Okay, yeah.
That can lead to faster innovation and greater customer satisfaction.
So it's like speeding up communication within the system. What's the next level of leverage?
Next up are feedback loops.
Okay, we talked about balancing and reinforcing loops.
Right. This leverage point is about strengthening or weakening those loops.
So fine-tuning the thermostat, so to speak.
Exactly, making the system more responsive to deviations from the desired state.
And this can apply to all sorts of systems.
Oh, absolutely. From regulating body temperature to managing financial markets.
Okay, so what about reinforcing loops? Can we leverage those too?
We can.
Mm-hmm.
The next leverage point is adjusting the strength of those loops.
Okay, those are the loops that can create those virtuous or vicious cycles.
Exactly, like the viral video example.
Right. So how do we use this for good?
It's about understanding what's driving growth or decline, and then finding ways to either amplify the positive or dampen the negative.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, think about the movement to promote renewable energy.
Okay.
By creating incentives for clean energy,
Mm-hmm.
we can tap into a reinforcing loop. That accelerates the transition away from fossil fuels.
So it's like harnessing the power of compounding for good.
Precisely. Small changes in reinforcing loops can have huge long-term impacts.
That's amazing. What's next on Meadows' list?
Next is changing information flows.
Information flows.
Right. It's about who has access to information and how that information is shared within a system.
Information is power, they say.
It is. Imagine a company where only top management has all the data.
Okay.
That can create a disconnect between decision makers and those doing the work.
Right.
But if everyone has access to relevant information, they can make better decisions.
So it's like democratizing information.
Exactly. It unlocks the collective intelligence of the system.
What's the next level of leverage?
Now we're getting into some serious power moves.
Okay, lay it on me.
The next level is changing the rules of the system.
The rules. So like rewriting the rule book.
Exactly. The rules define what's possible within a system. Changing them can fundamentally change behavior.
Can you give us some examples?
Think of laws that guarantee equal rights or policies that protect the environment.
Right. Those are game changers.
They are.
What's next on the list?
Next is self-organization.
Self-organization.
Yeah, it's about tapping into the system's ability to adapt and learn.
So it's like recognizing that systems aren't static machines, but living, breathing organisms that can evolve.
Exactly. And it's often more effective than trying to control everything from the top down.
Can you give me an example?
Imagine a company that encourages experimentation
Okay.
and embraces diversity of thought.
Right.
That's a company that's tapping into self-organization.
So it's like creating fertile ground for innovation.
Precisely.
Okay, what's the next level of leverage?
Now we're getting to the really powerful stuff.
All right, I'm ready.
The next level is changing the goals of the system.
The goals, so like changing the system's purpose.
Exactly. The goals drive everything.
Okay.
If a company's only goal is profit, it might cut corners on the environment or employee well-being.
Right.
But if you shift the goal to include sustainability and social responsibility, you'll see a dramatic change in behavior.
It's like changing the destination of a journey. The whole path changes accordingly.
Precisely.
I'm sensing we're about to reach the top of this leverage point ladder.
We are.
What's the most powerful leverage point of them all?
The most powerful leverage point is changing the paradigm.
The paradigm. Okay, tell me more.
A paradigm is a set of beliefs and assumptions that shape our understanding of the world.
So it's like the lens through which we see reality.
Exactly. Paradigms influence everything, from our individual choices to the design of our social systems.
That's incredibly powerful.
It is. Changing a paradigm is like upgrading your operating system.
I like that analogy.
It opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
Can you give me an example of a paradigm shift?
Sure. Think about the shift from a geocentric to a heliocentric view of the universe.
Okay, where the Earth was no longer considered the center.
Exactly. It revolutionized astronomy and paved the way for countless scientific advancements.
Wow, that's a fundamental shift in how we see the world.
It is.
But I imagine changing a paradigm is no easy feat.
It's not. It takes time and effort, and often a combination of factors like scientific discoveries, social movements, and personal transformations.
But it's the most potent leverage point.
It is, because it changes the very foundation of the system.
So it's like changing the DNA of the system.
Exactly.
Wow, we've explored this whole list of leverage points, from tweaking numbers to shifting paradigms. It's amazing to think that we have so much agency.
We do.
So where do we go from here? How do we actually use this knowledge?
Well, Meadows gives us lots of practical advice.
Okay, great.
One key suggestion is to understand a system's behavior over time.
Okay, so like becoming a historian of the system.
Exactly. By observing long-term behavior, we can glean insights into its underlying structure.
It's like watching a movie and paying attention to the recurring themes and characters.
Yes. It helps us understand the plot and predict how the story might unfold.
So we become systems detectives.
Precisely.
What else does Meadows recommend?
She emphasizes respecting boundaries.
Boundaries.
We often draw boundaries around systems to make them easier to study.
Okay.
But in reality, there are no truly separate systems.
Right. Everything is connected.
Exactly. We need to be mindful of the broader context.
Yeah.
And consider the ripple effects of our actions.
So it's like trying to understand a forest by only looking at a single tree.
You got it.
What else should we be doing to become better systems thinkers?
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into thinking in systems. We've been exploring all these fascinating concepts.
Yeah.
I'm curious how we can start applying this stuff in our everyday lives.
Well, Meadows offers some really practical advice.
Okay, great. Let's hear it.
One key thing she emphasizes is learning to see the world through a systems lens.
Right, so instead of just reacting to events, we start to see them as part of a bigger picture.
Exactly. It's like the difference between reading a headline and understanding the whole story.
Okay, I like that. Meadows encourages us to ask questions, like, where did this event come from? And what are the patterns over time?
So we're looking for the underlying structures that are driving those events.
Exactly. And we need to remember that events are rarely caused by simple cause and effect.
Right. It's more complex than that.
It's like a tapestry, where tugging on one thread can create ripples throughout.
Okay, so what else can we do to put systems thinking into practice?
Another important tip is to pay attention to stocks and flows.
Ah, those building blocks we talked about. The nouns and verbs of systems.
Precisely. Think of managing your finances.
Okay.
You need to pay attention to your income and expenses, but also your overall savings and debt.
Right, the flows and the stocks.
Exactly. Understanding how they interact is crucial.
So how can we apply this to other systems?
Well, Meadows says we should look beyond events and focus on the underlying accumulations and rates of change.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, if you're trying to understand a city's housing crisis, don't just look at how many new apartments are being built. Look at the total stock of affordable housing.
Right, so it's about getting a grasp on the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What else? Meadows also suggests using diagrams to visualize systems.
Ah, those spaghetti and meatball diagrams.
Those are the ones. They're like maps that help us navigate complexity.
Okay, so we can see the relationships between different parts and identify those feedback loops and leverage points.
Exactly. It's like drawing a blueprint of the system so we can understand how it all works.
So we're not just flying blind.
Right. Experiment with different types of diagrams and see what works best for you.
It's like choosing the right lens for your camera to get the best shot.
I like that analogy.
Okay, what else?
Another important tip is to identify those feedback loops.
Right, the circular cause and effect relationships that can either stabilize or destabilize a system.
Exactly. Look for patterns of behavior over time,
Okay.
like a company's profits consistently declining. That might signal a reinforcing feedback loop, where declining sales lead to cost-cutting, which further reduces quality and leads to even lower sales.
So the system is trapped in a downward spiral.
Exactly. And once you identify those loops, you can start looking for leverage points to change things.
So we're like systems detectives.
Precisely, uncovering the hidden forces at play.
Okay, what else does Meadows recommend?
She encourages us to embrace uncertainty.
Embrace uncertainty. That sounds a bit scary.
I know, it can feel uncomfortable. But systems are complex and constantly changing. We can't predict or control everything.
Right, it's like trying to control a river. It's going to flow where it wants to flow.
Exactly. So Meadows suggests being more flexible and adaptive in our approach.
So being okay with not having all the answers
Right.
and being willing to adjust course as we go.
Exactly. It's a
Okay.
more realistic way to approach systems.
Okay, what else?
Meadows also encourages us to honor and celebrate diversity.
Diversity. How does that fit into systems thinking?
Well, diversity is essential for resilience, creativity, and adaptation.
Okay, I can see that.
A system with a wide range of perspectives and resources is better equipped to handle change.
Like a rainforest, right?
Exactly. It's teeming with life and can withstand all sorts of disturbances because of its diversity.
So it's like having a diversified investment portfolio.
That's a great analogy.
You're less vulnerable to risk when you don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Meadows reminds us that our modern world often prioritizes efficiency and standardization.
Right, which can lead to less diversity.
Exactly. We need to be mindful of that and find ways to protect and promote diversity.
Okay, so diversity is not just a social good, it's also essential for healthy systems.
It is.
What other advice does Meadows have for us?
She emphasizes focusing on the long term.
Okay, we've talked about expanding our time horizons, but it's easier said than done, right?
It is. Our brains are wired to prioritize immediate rewards and threats.
Right, it takes effort to think long term.
It does. But so many of our problems today are the result of short-term thinking.
So it's like we're accumulating a debt that future generations will have to pay.
Exactly. Meadows challenges us to break free from that pattern
Okay, so how do we do that?
by asking ourselves, what kind of world do we want to leave behind?
That's a powerful question.
It is. It helps us shift our perspective.
Okay, what else can we do to be better systems thinkers?
Meadows challenges us to be more mindful of unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, but how can we anticipate everything?
We can't predict everything, but we can slow down our decision-making.
Okay, so take a pause.
Exactly. Gather diverse input and try to map out potential consequences.
So it's about being more thoughtful and deliberate.
Exactly. What else? Experiment. Don't implement huge changes all at once.
Okay.
Test things out on a smaller scale first, observe the results, and adjust as you go.
So it's a process of trial and error.
It is. It's about learning as you go.
What else does Meadows emphasize?
She reminds us to locate responsibility within the system.
Right, we talked about designing systems that provide direct feedback on the consequences of our actions.
Exactly. When people experience the impact of their choices, they're more likely to act responsibly.
So it's about building in those natural incentives.
Precisely. It's a powerful way to promote positive change.
Okay, what else should we remember?
Stay humble, stay a learner.
That's good advice for life in general.
It is. But it's especially important for systems thinkers.
Okay, why is that?
Systems are always changing. We'll never have all the answers.
Right, so we need to be open to new information and willing to adjust our thinking.
Exactly. It's about embracing lifelong learning.
Okay, what else?
Celebrate complexity.
I think we've hit on that theme a few times already.
We have, but it's worth repeating.
Okay, why is it so important to celebrate complexity?
Because it's the source of so much beauty and wonder in the world.
Right, it's what makes life interesting.
Exactly. Instead of seeing complexity as a problem, see it as an opportunity.
Okay, I'm starting to see things differently already.
That's great. Meadows also challenges us to defy the disciplines.
Defy the disciplines, what does that mean?
It means breaking free from the silos of traditional academia and embracing a more interdisciplinary approach.
Right, so recognizing that real-world problems don't fit neatly into categories.
Exactly. The most interesting questions often lie at the intersection of disciplines.
So it's about drawing from multiple fields of knowledge And collaborating across boundaries.
Precisely, is how we get a more holistic understanding.
Okay, what else does Meadows encourage us to do?
She challenges us to expand the boundary of caring.
We talked about that earlier. It's about extending our compassion to all beings and even future generations.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness and making choices that benefit the whole.
It's a beautiful vision.
It is.
What else does Meadows urge us to do?
She urges us to not erode the goal of goodness.
Okay, remind me what that means.
It means holding on to hope, even in the face of challenges, and choosing goodness, even when it's hard.
So it's about believing in the possibility of a better world and acting in ways that support that vision.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an incredible journey into thinking in systems. Meadows' insights are so profound and timely.
They really are. This book is a gift.
It is. It's given us a powerful framework for understanding complexity and creating a better future.
And that's what makes systems thinking so hopeful.
It reminds us that we have the power to make a difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into systems thinking.
I hope you enjoyed today's deep dive. If you'd like to discuss any of the questions or anything that you heard in the podcast, or would like the team to do a deep dive into a different topic, please join the LinkedIn group and let me know. I look forward to providing you with many more deep dives into the applications of systems thinking. Take care.